48 hours. That is how long it took after Patton's cable reached Eisenhower's headquarters before a reply arrived in Bavaria telling him to let the matter drop. The cable Patton had sent described what a Soviet officer had done to a Red Cross nurse in the American occupation zone in July 1945. It named the officer. It named the witnesses. It attached the statements of American military personnel who had been present at the scene. The reply from Eisenhower's headquarters did not dispute the evidence. It did not question the witnesses. It said the matter would be handled through diplomatic channels, and that Patton was to take no further action pending resolution. The resolution never came. We're going to tell you everything about this today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with what was actually in those files, and then we'll get into what it means. This was not supposed to reach the public.
The summer of 1945 was the moment when the official version of the war's end was being assembled and distributed to the American people, and that version had a specific shape. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side. They had defeated fascism together. The future was going to be built on the foundation of that alliance, and the men in Washington who were managing the transition from war to occupation needed that foundation to hold, at least publicly, for long enough to get the political architecture of the post-war world into place. Incidents that did not fit that version of events were, where possible, kept out of the version that reached the American public. There were a great many such incidents. By July 1945, the American and Soviet occupation zones in Germany and Austria shared extensive borders, and the daily reality of that shared border was generating a steady stream of reports that American military officers were filing through their chain of command and that were not making it into any newspaper. Soviet forces moving through areas near the border of the American zone were being documented by American military intelligence in terms that were incompatible with the public narrative of Allied cooperation. The treatment of displaced persons, particularly those the Soviets categorized as Soviet nationals, and therefore subject to forced repatriation, was being documented in reports that used careful military language to describe things that had no careful language adequate to them. The reports that were reaching Patton's headquarters by midsummer contained accounts that American military intelligence officers were finding difficult to process in relation to the official characterization of the Soviet Union as an ally with shared values and a common purpose. Soviet forces that had moved through German territory in the final months of the war had left a record that Allied investigators were beginning to compile in systematic terms. Hospitals had been looted. Medical equipment had been removed from facilities that were treating patients. In several documented cases, medical personnel had been assaulted by Soviet soldiers, and in at least 2 cases, the assaults had been fatal. These incidents had occurred primarily in territory that had been under Soviet control before American or British forces arrived, which meant they fell into a jurisdictional gray area that the liaison protocols governing inter-Allied relations were not designed to address. The July incident was different in a specific and legally significant way. It occurred in the American occupation zone. The facility was under American authority. The American military police who filed the reports had clear standing to investigate and, if the facts warranted, to prosecute. The facts warranted. Medical facilities operating near the boundary zones were in a particularly exposed position. The International Red Cross had established several temporary facilities in the area to handle the enormous volume of sick and wounded people moving through the region in the months after the German surrender. These facilities were staffed by Red Cross volunteers and personnel from multiple Allied nations, operating in buildings marked with the standard protective designations. They were not in the Soviet occupation zone. They were in territory under American control. A Soviet liaison column moving through the American zone in early July 1945 stopped at one of these facilities. The column was on a documented route, traveling through American territory under the liaison protocols that allowed Soviet military vehicles to move through the American zone for specific purposes. The commanding officer of the column was a Soviet major, and his mission, officially, was to collect Soviet nationals from a displaced persons camp several kilometers further along his route. What happened at the medical facility was witnessed by 3 American soldiers who were providing security for the building and by 2 Belgian Red Cross volunteers. Their accounts, taken separately by American military police within 24 hours of the incident, were consistent. The Soviet major entered the facility without requesting permission from the American personnel present. He moved through the rooms, conducting what appeared to be a search for Soviet nationals among the patients and staff. In a room at the back of the facility, he encountered a Red Cross volunteer who was tending to a patient. The specific exchange that preceded what followed is documented in the witness statements. The nurse did not speak Russian. The major did not speak English or French. The communication between them was through gesture and tone, and the tone escalated within a short time. The nurse was attempting to prevent the major from removing a patient she was treating, a man who had been identified on the facility's records as a displaced person of uncertain nationality, and who the major appeared to believe was a Soviet national subject to his authority. The patient survived. The nurse did not. The American soldiers who were present at the facility filed their reports within hours. The reports reached Patton's headquarters by the following morning. By the afternoon, Patton had read the statements and had written the cable to Eisenhower. The Soviet major's column had left the American zone before any American unit could intercept it. He was back inside Soviet-controlled territory by the time the first American response was being organized. The Soviets, when contacted through the liaison channel that existed for exactly this kind of incident, acknowledged that the major's column had passed through the American zone on the documented route. They did not acknowledge anything else. They said the matter would be investigated internally. The internal investigation, if it occurred, produced no result that was ever communicated to the American side. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Before the second cable, Patton had asked his intelligence officer whether the Soviet major could be identified through any American channel without involving the Soviet liaison structure. The answer was yes, partially. The column's route had been logged by American checkpoints. The vehicle identification numbers were in the checkpoint records. Cross-referencing the vehicle numbers with Soviet liaison documentation allowed for a probable identification of the unit, and from the unit, a probable identification of the commanding officer. The identification was not definitive in the legal sense, but it was sufficient for Patton's purposes. He wrote the major's name in the second cable. He asked the Soviets to confirm the identification and to produce the officer for questioning. The Soviet response to this request, delivered through the liaison channel 24 hours later, was that the officer in question had been transferred and that his current assignment was not available through channels accessible to American liaison personnel. The transfer had taken place within 48 hours of the incident. Someone on the Soviet side had moved quickly. Whether the speed of the transfer reflected advanced knowledge of what had happened at the facility or simply standard Soviet practice for managing personnel who had created exposure was not something the American intelligence assessment could determine with confidence. Patton's response to the reply from Eisenhower's headquarters was not what Eisenhower's staff had hoped for. He sent a second cable. The second cable was longer than the first and contained language that the officer who received it described as the most direct communication he had received from a senior general in his military career. Patton stated that the major's name was known, that his unit was identified, that he was inside Soviet-controlled territory, but that Soviet-controlled territory shared a border with American-controlled territory, and that the American command had both the legal standing and the practical capability to demand the major's transfer to American custody for prosecution. He stated that the alternative, which was to allow a Soviet officer who had killed a Red Cross worker in the American occupation zone to remain in Soviet custody where no prosecution was possible, was not an outcome he was prepared to accept in silence. Eisenhower replied personally. The reply acknowledged Patton's position. It explained, with the patience of a man who had been managing Patton for 3 years and understood the specific kind of patience it required, that demanding the transfer of a Soviet officer from Soviet custody for prosecution in an American military court was not something the current political situation permitted. It explained that the four-power occupation of Germany depended on a cooperative relationship between the Allied commands that could not survive the kind of confrontation Patton was proposing. It told Patton that the matter was being handled through diplomatic channels at a level above his command authority and that he was to stand down. The specific legal question that Patton's cables raised was one that American military lawyers had been quietly discussing since the spring. Under the laws of war and the occupation protocols, The American military command had jurisdiction over crimes committed in the American zone by any person, including members of Allied forces. The theory was clear. The practice was something else. Exercising jurisdiction over a Soviet officer meant demanding that officer's transfer from Soviet custody. Demanding that transfer meant issuing an ultimatum. Issuing an ultimatum to the Soviet command in Germany in the summer of 1945, when the four-power occupation framework was still being assembled, and every interaction between the Allied commands was being managed with an eye toward preserving the political architecture that was supposed to govern post-war Europe, was not something anyone in the American command was authorized to do on their own. It was, in the assessment of the political officers at Eisenhower's headquarters, the kind of action that could unravel agreements that had taken months to negotiate. The practical effect was that jurisdiction that existed in theory was suspended by political calculation in practice. The major was untouchable, not because the Americans lacked authority, but because exercising that authority would have cost more than the people responsible for the cost-benefit analysis were willing to pay. Patton stood down in the formal sense. He sent no more cables on the subject through official channels. He did not, however, consider the matter closed, and the men around him in Bavaria in the weeks that followed observed in him a specific kind of anger that was different from the ordinary anger that most of them had grown accustomed to over the previous years. It was quieter. It was more settled. Several of his officers noted in accounts written after his death that the July incident appeared to mark a change in him, a shift from the managed frustration he had been carrying about the Soviet situation since the spring to something harder and more deliberate. In the weeks after the second cable, Patton convened a meeting of his senior staff and the American Red Cross liaison officers operating in the Bavaria zone. The meeting was not on his official schedule. The topic was the security of Red Cross facilities in areas accessible to Soviet liaison columns. The outcome of the meeting was a set of informal protocols, not published in any order and not communicated to Eisenhower's headquarters, governing how American military personnel were to respond if Soviet forces entered Red Cross facilities without authorization. The protocols were specific, and they left no ambiguity about what the response was to include. He continued filing reports through channels about Soviet behavior in and near the American occupation zone. He continued issuing directives to American units along the border about how to respond to Soviet incursions. He continued, in conversations with his staff and with visiting journalists and with the parade of officials who came through his headquarters, saying what he thought about what the Soviet Union was and what it intended to do in Europe. The incident did not appear in any American newspaper. It did not appear in any official communique. It did not appear in the diplomatic exchange that the Eisenhower cable had promised was handling the matter through appropriate channels. What it did appear in was Patton's diary, where the entry for the relevant week contains a description of the incident, a description of his correspondence with Eisenhower, and a characterization of the reply he received that is not diplomatic in any sense. He wrote that the reply told him everything he needed to know about what the alliance with the Soviet Union was actually worth. He wrote that he had spent his military career being told that sentiment had no place in command decisions, that what mattered was what could be achieved, and not what should be achieved in some ideal version of the situation, and that he had accepted this framework for most of his career because the evidence supported it. He wrote that the evidence no longer supported it, that the framework being used to make decisions in the summer of 1945 was not actually separating the achievable from the unachievable. It was separating the politically convenient from the politically inconvenient, and it was calling that separation strategy. He wrote that the specific crime committed in the facility, committed against a woman who was unarmed and clearly identified as a medical worker, had been allowed to stand because the political machinery that was supposed to deliver justice had calculated that delivering justice was not worth the diplomatic cost. He wrote that this calculation was going to be made again, and that each time it was made, the people doing the calculating were going to tell themselves it was temporary, that the situation would eventually allow for the right outcome, and that the right outcome would never arrive, because the calculation that prevented it was not temporary. It was the foundation. The September press conference that officially ended Patton's tenure as military governor of Bavaria, where he compared Nazi Party membership to American political party affiliation, is typically presented as the proximate cause of his removal from command. It was the stated reason.
It was not the only reason, and it was not, in the view of the officers who observed Patton closely in the months between July and October, the real explanation for the change that had occurred in him. The July incident was one of several that summer that had the same structure: a documented Soviet action in or near the American zone, an American attempt to address it through channels, a response from those channels that made clear the address would go nowhere, and Patton left with the knowledge and no recourse. Each iteration of this structure had the same effect on him. It was not that he became more angry. He had been angry since May. It was that he became more certain. The cables he was receiving from Eisenhower's headquarters were telling him, in the careful language of military correspondence, that the political machinery operating above his level had made decisions about what the American alliance with the Soviet Union required, and those decisions were going to hold, regardless of what was documented in the reports coming out of Bavaria. He was right. The diplomatic channels Eisenhower referenced produced nothing. The Soviet major was never identified by name in any public document. The Red Cross volunteer who died in the facility in July 1945 was recorded in International Red Cross files as having died in the occupation zone during the post-war period. The cause of death in the file is listed as circumstances under investigation. The investigation produced no official finding. The men who were at Patton's headquarters in Bavaria in the weeks after the incident remember the specific way he read correspondence during that period. They remember that he read Eisenhower's personal reply without expression and set it on his desk and did not speak for several minutes. They remember that when he did speak, what he said was not about the cable. He asked about the security arrangements at the remaining medical facilities near the border. He asked whether the Red Cross personnel at those facilities had been informed of what had happened and what precautions were being taken. He asked these questions as if the answers mattered more than anything in the cable he had just set down, which was because they did. They remember that he knew her name. He had taken it from the American military police report and written it in his diary, and he used it in conversations about the incident. He did not refer to her as the victim, or as the Red Cross worker, or as the woman at the facility. He used her name every time. She was 24 years old. She had been in Europe since the liberation of France. The file was closed. His diary entry was not. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve in the American occupation zone in Germany or Austria after 1945? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.